Hello and welcome to our first podcast where we aim to shine a spotlight on a group that often serves quietly but sacrifices deeply.
The Armed Forces Community.
Say that a bit louder, loosely.
The Armed Forces Community.
Excellent. Okay, so my name's Dave Smith and I'm a UK Armed Forces veteran, having served over 23 years in the British Army.
My name is Lucy Woodward. I'm the Defence Medical Welfare Officer and daughter of an Army veteran.
Now, prior to this meeting, Lucy complained that I did the script and, I'm Dave Smith and all that lot, and I just put, hello, my name is Lucy Woodward, and that was it.
Yeah, I'm not happy about that.
No, well, I'm sorry. You were late, and that's the reason behind it. Okay, so whether they're serving personnel, veterans, reservists, or family members, the Armed Forces community plays a vital role in our society. But what happens when the uniform comes off? What support is available, and how can the NHS and other organisations and services help bridge the gap between military and civilian life?
In this episode, we're going to explore who the UK Armed Forces community are, the unique challenges faced by those in the Armed Forces community, the real impact of the Armed Forces Covenant and the power of partnership, and how, as colleagues, professionals and citizens, we can better understand and advocate for their needs.
Nice. Now, do you know what? It's really funny. I feel like I'm on a speed dating sort of thing here. So, hello, I'm Dave, Virgo, aged 54.
Yeah, you're the old one.
Do you know what? I sound like a professional there. I've never actually been on a speed dating, or I don't even need to, as a matter of fact. But anyway, let's move on. I'm digressing slightly. Okay, so whether you're part of the NHS, the Armed Forces, or simply someone who wants to make a difference, stay with us. This is more than a conversation. It's a call to awareness, action, and appreciation.
Okay, Dave, let's get started. Who are the Armed Forces community?
You tell me. You work with them just as much as I do.
That's very true. So the Armed Forces community doesn't just include the veterans, the regulars, or the reservists themselves. It also includes their family members, which are often overlooked.
Absolutely. So when we talk about the Armed Forces community, we also have to include those that are actually serving. So these are members that are what we call the regulars. So these are members of the Armed Forces, Navy, Army, Air Force that are actually in the job, in the role as part of our commitments to the UK defence, and are doing a fantastic job both on UK soil and overseas. Our reservists are members that are part of a civilian organisation such as ours, and basically they do a full-time role within their current employment, but they have a commitment to be part of the Armed Forces. So, like a
part-time job.
Absolutely. Thanks for helping me out there. Okay. So, and they have to do basically about 2 to 3 weeks every year. They do all of the sort of training or areas of training that the regulars do to make sure that they're able to do all of those activities if called upon, like weapon drills, first aid, communication, map reading, all of those vital areas. But as part of the reserves, not only do you go through the military style training, you also go through trade related training as part of those. So our reservists make up a huge commitment as part of our Armed Forces community as well. Veterans. Tell me about a veteran, Lucy.
So I work very closely with veterans. They play a big part in my my job role and also my life, because obviously my dad was a veteran. So I've grown up around them, and they're very unique members of our population. They yes, you have to know them to understand them. I think it's like they have a whole different language, but we learn to have to understand them because they make up such a huge part of our our community.
So just to put you in perspective, a veteran isn't, a lot of people think a veteran is somebody like Uncle Albert's off Only Fools and Horses, spotted it for 2000 in the desert when I was in and all that lot. Let's break that stigma. So a veteran is anyone that has served previously in Her Majesty's forces for 1 day or currently His Majesty's forces, and I'd say it's just 1 day, 1 day paid day in His Majesty's or previously Her Majesty's service. So you could see a veteran as young as 16 nowadays, or 17. Now, when I joined the army back in the day, I was 17 and a half. So young, naive, not much older now, but showing,
I
maybe
think
showing
many people join young, for various reasons. Whether there's issues at home or they just want to get out and travel and see the world. We need to, take into account why people join as well. I think is a big thing to understand them.
Now, obviously, Lucy, you're a family member of someone that served in the military. Do you want to explain a little bit more about family members?
Yeah. So when we talk about veterans and the armed forces, we tend to think of the regulars, the reservists, those that actually take part in the armed forces sort of training. What we don't understand at the moment, and what we want to raise awareness of, is the impact that has on families. Because obviously we're there to support the member who is, going through the training, seeing potentially horrific things, yet we still have to come home and, try and support them to go through that. Whether that's children, spouses, family members, mothers, brothers, things like that. Everybody who is part of their life will have an impact of what they've seen, what they've done, and trying to support them to go through that. It's very difficult because a lot of time family members are overlooked. We need to give them the support as well as the veterans and the serving personnel.
Absolutely. And for me, I was married during my time in the armed forces, and my wife was a pivotal strength for me. Kept the home fires burning, in times when I was deployed overseas and operations, and really sort of was there as a sort of rock to keep me going in times of hardship, sort of sorrow, depression maybe. But yeah, had to pick up the pieces when I came home. Wanted to talk about things, but was there, and supported me all the way through my career. And my wife had to sacrifice her own career to follow me around in my career, and I really respect that. And for those family members that do the same.
Yeah, it's something we have to, think of when we think of the armed forces, and Remembrance Day is a big one. We don't just want to remember the sacrifices that they made themselves, but also, like you said about your wife, sacrifices that she made, that she's had to, not have the career potentially that she wanted, potentially having to look after your daughter while you were away. It takes a huge toll on them as well, and I think we have to, open up that community to include those.
And as a dependent, I think it's very much important to realise what sacrifices they have to go through as well. And naturally, Lucy, you were a dependent. How was your home life or your life, impacted through the armed forces as a dependent for you?
So it's very difficult because obviously as a child, it's, you don't really understand what being a grown up means originally, especially those who, have roles such as the armed forces, which tend to be sometimes quite secretive. There's a lot of times you don't know where people are. They can't really get in contact as much as you would potentially like. And you obviously are worried, and that has a big effect on anybody, but even more so a child. Not knowing when their dad's going to be coming home, if they're going to come home, unfortunately, in some cases. And it's a hard thing to comprehend for a young child who has still got to, go to school, is being uprooted, things like that. And it is very difficult.
Yeah, and I suppose speaking to my daughter, she's not young anymore. She's 25.
That's because you're getting old.
Yeah, thanks. But obviously, as she was young growing up, we moved maybe we moved so many times I've forgotten how many times. But my daughter would have been to so many different types of schools. Had to sort of leave her friends and a sort of the group that she's got used to over 2 to 3 years, in one posting. And then, we've resettled or moved or relocated to another area, and she has to go through all of that nervous element around having to go back to a new school, meet new teachers, meet new friends, settle into a new house. It's really quite daunting, really.
Yeah, especially if you're moving regularly. Like say, sometimes deployments are 2-3 years. Sometimes it can be as little as months.
Yeah.
You just about get settled somewhere, feel comfortable, and you're up and off again, which I think is very difficult, especially for a child who doesn't understand.
No,
if they're,
absolutely.
especially if they are very young, they don't understand why they're moving every 2 to 3 months potentially.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so as you can see, the family members play a crucial part, and the armed forces community, as I say, it's not just that serving member of all three service. It is the whole, once you leave the military and become a veteran, those that are still, in those roles and doing reserve capability as well. And I must say, we also have what we call reserve liability. So reserve liability is when we leave the armed forces, depending on what terms and conditions of service we're on, we often have a reserve liability when we actually leave the military. So for me, I had a reserve liability of 15 years, and that actually ends next year.
Again, because you're getting old.
I know. Thank you. So in that time frame, it doesn't mean that I'm actively, part of a unit and all of that. Like, it just means that in times of national emergency, conflict, I could be called upon to fill a role, maybe in home territory or overseas, but only if required. So yeah, I remain on that reserve liability until that end. But as I say, at this particular time, I'm not a reservist, and I'm going through that active military training, and I don't think I can do the physical aspect of that anymore.
Again, because you're getting old.
Yeah, I put a bit of weight on, but yeah, okay. All right, so I think it's probably good now to move on a little bit and actually understand sort of what our figures of the armed forces community are, locally and within nationally as well.
Yeah, definitely. Do you want me to go, or do you want to go? Okay. So as of 2025, there are approximately 181,890 people serving in the UK Armed Forces. So that includes personnel, reserves, and other military roles. In sort of Staffordshire themselves, we have quite a high population, which is something that we need to think of, as a local sort of population within that wider figure. There are around 137 there are around 137,000 regular personnel within our forces, and they make up the largest share. I can't do this.
I suppose the British Army making up the largest share. That's what she means to say. Followed by the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force.
I can't get my words out today.
Okay. I'll go next. So here in Staffordshire, the armed forces community is especially significant. According to the 2021 census, and that was the first time that the armed forces community were included on the census back in 2021. So basically the census is saying that over 30,700 residents, are part of the armed forces community. And that's basically around 4.2% of the local population, which is quite a lot. So that 4.2% of the local population have previously served in the UK Armed Forces, which is above, realistically, the national average. Areas like Stafford have particularly high concentrations with over 6,000 veterans, and accounting for about 5.3% of the town's population. So that's quite a large number.
That's a very large number, especially when you look at statistics from other areas of the country. It's one of those where, we have to take that into account and provide more support within this area that may not be required in the areas where there's less of them.
Absolutely. Over to you, Lizzie.
Thank you. So veterans in Staffordshire are more likely to be older, with nearly 78% over 50, and they're more likely to report being in poor health. So that's 11.7% compared to 6.5% in the general population.
Okay, so yeah, that's got a sort of giving you an oversight into sort of, who the armed forces community are, what the numbers are, and sort of, now let's take a look at, so I'm a veteran, and obviously you deal with veterans. Tell me what your perception of a veteran is.
Everybody differs, but the main comparison to have is that they are very proud people. They want to not have the support. They don't want to ask for the support that they ultimately need. And it's very difficult for them to reach out for that support because they've never had to do it before. being in the military, you have everything sort of on hand. You can, if you need a doctor, you get seen the same day. So obviously when, you leave the military and you come out and have to, have a civilian GP, obviously the wait times for GP appointments at the moment aren't the best. So it's a big
Improving.
struggle. So it's a big struggle. It's a big change for them to, to have to deal with. And veterans obviously don't sometimes process that very well. And we need to, as healthcare workers and, working for charities that support veterans, we need to make sure, that we're supporting them with that transition and the issues that they have when they do come out, because they ultimately sometimes won't ask for it themselves.
Absolutely. Now, just to put you in perspective, obviously from a veteran's perspective myself, I agree with everything Lucy's saying there. I don't like asking for help. My body's a temple. It doesn't break. Well, it didn't break then, but it is breaking now. But a lot of veterans, including myself initially, are totally unaware of the services that are out there to support them, and often feel that actually I don't want help. I don't feel I need help, and are often sometimes ashamed by asking for help, and especially when it comes to mental health. So there's always been a stigma mental health, especially in the forces, that actually, we don't want to show weakness. We don't want to show that actually, I'm vulnerable and stuff like that. So we bottle things up realistically, and I've told my wife many stories where I've been on operational tour and something's happened, but I don't necessarily want to share it at that time because I don't want to pass the burden on to somebody else that I then potentially will worry about when I'm on operation duty. And she was, absolutely shocked by it, but totally understood that rationale behind it. But a lot of veterans are out there still suffering because they've never shared experiences. They've never put themselves in and admitted they may have a mental health concern or a problem, or indeed even feel that they have something. It's never been processed. And back in those times, I'm going back 20 years or so, even less than that really. The mental health support wasn't actually there within the military. It was discussed and, but yeah, it was never really supported as well as it should be. Nowadays, it's phenomenal. There is some great support out there, and it's totally understood, and it's totally discussed, and it's totally open, which is great.
There's been huge strides made in that area, and obviously working with veterans every day, I see veterans who were national service veterans, to those that you were saying are very young, maybe Afghan, Iraq veterans who are coming through, and the difference in mental health, support that they've accessed, or actually just being able to talk about it is, you see that very stark difference between the two generations, basically. We are making great progress, and that's what we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I suppose a lot of veterans or armed forces community services have come to light in recent years. And when I say recent years, in the past 10 years, because of what we call the Armed Forces Covenant. So the Armed Forces Covenant, do you want to explain that, or shall I?
I'll let you do it.
Thanks. Okay. So the Armed Forces Covenant, it came, into, or was publicised in 2011. And basically what it is, it's a moral and legal commitment by the UK government to support organisations, including the NHS, to ensure that actually no member of the armed forces community, and as I say, we've gone through what the armed forces community is disadvantaged compared to other citizens. Special consideration is also, or should also be given in some cases, especially for those that have given so much, such as the injured and the bereaved. Now, the Armed Forces Covenant, it's only as good realistically as those that actually act upon it. So when realistically the Armed Forces Covenant was introduced, it's like, a lot of organisations went through the process of, let's sign the Armed Forces Covenant, let's put the Covenant logo on our letterheads and various plaques on the walls and that. But,
sometimes don't put it into action, which is, unfortunate, because you sign that, that covenant to make those changes. You're willing to to do that, and some people obviously don't do it, and it's it's very sad.
But there's a lot of organisations out there from the start and that continue to do so, provide some absolutely fantastic support for the armed forces community. Now, to help sort of make that covenant a little bit more solid, a little bit more robust, they enshrined it into law. So in 2022, they sort of enshrined it into law as part of the Armed Forces Act. And basically, there was elements of what we call statutory bodies that would sort of have legal obligations to put their, I suppose, their commitments and actions into force, and that includes local governments, our NHS, other services like that responsible for housing, education, employment, healthcare. So these are those statutory bodies that we're talking about now. So the Armed Forces Covenant now. So we have commitments when it comes to NHS. We have certain commitments associated around that as well. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or I can.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about that. So obviously within the NHS, we do have those commitments that you've just been talking about. So the main one is priority access to care. So veterans who have had a service-related injury will then be put on what is called the priority scheme within the NHS. So anybody who's had a service-related incident, whether that was yesterday or 10 years down the line, anything that's service related and you need medical attention for will be classed under the NHS Priority Scheme. That's so that these individuals aren't disadvantaged, because obviously that issue was caused by their time in service defending our country, and obviously because of the covenant being in law, we have a duty to look after those veterans. It doesn't mean that they're going to go to the top of the waiting list, because obviously there are civilians who also need the support. However, we need to prioritise that that service to our country does mean something, and we want to give back so they're not disadvantaged. The other things are, specialist services that have been created to support veterans in the armed forces community. So obviously we talked about mental health support that, people struggle to access. A lot of the veterans that I've worked with tend to struggle with civilian mental health services because, unfortunately the therapists don't have that background of military understanding. They don't understand the things that they've been through. They struggle to empathise. So it came sort of, into people's thinking that maybe we should, create a specific veteran armed forces mental health support. So Op Courage was devised, and I refer to them quite regularly. And the support that they give to our veterans, I've seen firsthand how it works and how important it is. A lot of the veterans I work with have potentially never asked for mental health support, or don't want to go to civilian mental health support because they know that they won't understand. However, Op Courage, having that background within the military, understanding what they've been through, they're more likely to to seek that support, to carry on with it, and ultimately become better in themselves, which is great to see.
And I suppose, the reason why the name Op Courage was devised is because it actually takes courage for somebody to come forward and admit they have a mental health problem or a well-being related concern. So yeah, a lot of the services that we see now that are being introduced by the NHS, such as Op Courage, have that military operational name, and that's something that our veterans will relate to a little bit easier as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it doesn't just, stop at mental health. Again, like we said, we want to, remove any disadvantages that our armed forces community have. So not just mental health, that can be physical health. So obviously, again, any service-related injuries, any service-related injuries that, an individual will have, they can go through a service called Op Restore. Again, another op that, they'd be happy to go through because it, they have that background with operations. So what would happen is an Op Restore case would go through, and you'll go to your GP and say, I've got this issue, it's come from my time in service, can somebody help? And they will refer to Op Restore, and they look at what support is out there for them to get the best support to understand and treat that physical illness that they've got. And it works really well because, again, they've got that background of military understanding. Some of the clinicians have been in the armed forces, or armed forces community members, family members, things like that. And again, a lot of the veterans who go through that process prefer it to, you know, to civilian medicine, because again, they have that understanding. It's not, you know, it's not that they don't understand that that injury has come from something that might be quite traumatic, and they struggle to talk to, you know, talk about it. And they have that, you know, that understanding, which some civilian doctors don't, unfortunately.
Absolutely. Now, I suppose we need to emphasise at this point, so the whole idea of the Armed Forces Covenant and, you know, the principles associated around it, and the various sort of principles that we apply with related to within the NHS, is totally around reducing or taking away that disadvantage. It's not about creating an advantage, and that's what we need to ensure. So an example of that is, you know, anything that isn't service related, I wouldn't expect me as a veteran or any other veteran to go into the hospital and say, I'm a veteran, Armed Forces Covenant, priority healthcare, treat me, you know, as a priority, unless it's service related. You know, and what we also apply within the NHS, and it's across, you know, all sorts of areas, is that clinical priority. So, you know, even if I was to have what I would class as a, you know, an injury that needed priority treatment, when it comes to triaging and prioritizing, you know, we would expect all of those, you know, cancer or emergency trauma patients obviously to take preference, and then we would be slotted in, you know, not long, you know, where applicable, based upon our condition and our priority. So yeah, it's not an automatic get me to the front of the list, and that totally applies when you come into A&E. You know, every condition is prioritised and triaged. It doesn't entitle the veteran to get to the front of the queue in A&E or any emergency-related clinical procedures in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it's removing the disadvantage, not creating an advantage.
Absolutely. So yeah, so that you know, and where it works, you know, it is a fantastic element, and that's a total commitment to supporting our armed forces community members who have probably put their bodies mentally and physically under a lot more strain than they potentially wanted to sign up to, or didn't, you know, realise that actually when we get older,
it comes back to bite you.
We'll suffer a little bit more than we did in our younger days, and we're more sort of resilient to that.
Again, that's because Dave's getting old.
Yeah, thank you. It'll happen to you one day, Lucy.
We'll see. We'll see. I've got a few years yet.
Okay, so when we, as part of the Armed Forces commitment, you know, the UK sort of implemented various sort of strategies around healthcare, and one of those was the veteran-friendly sort of accreditation process within the GP practices. Do you want to discuss that at all, or shall I?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, like the hospitals that have the NHS, you know, veteran-aware accreditation, we have the GP, which is veteran-friendly GPs. So, what that means is anybody who is a veteran-friendly GP means that somebody within that, you know, that surgery or that organisation has undergone training to understand, you know, the military lifestyle, the backgrounds that, you know, accompany service-related injuries, and have a better understanding of it. Again, because veterans are very proud people, they don't like to ask for support. They often struggle to you know, to talk about things that might have been, you know, might be trauma, might be related to the injury that they've got. It's very difficult, and a lot of civilian doctors may not understand that it's, you know, it's difficult for these people to relive it. And it's things like, you know, GP appointments that might be a little bit longer for these individuals, so they can, you know, they've got the time to emotionally and physically, you know, get that information out there without feeling rushed and you know, ultimately not getting the help that they need because they're struggling to express that. So it's a great opportunity for people to, you know, access that support within primary care.
Absolutely. And I suppose what I must emphasise here, if you have served in the armed forces, you really do need to, when you register with your GP, you really do need to make them aware that you have served in the armed forces, and they will, you know, register you under their electronic patient records that you actually are part of the armed forces community. And that helps with any referrals or any treatment processes that actually they need to implement as part of that. So an example of that, if you don't register that you're part of the armed forces community and you do have a service related condition that needs a priority treatment, when a referral comes in from that GP practice into maybe secondary care hospital, it won't mention that the fact there's a priority treatment requirement around that. So the hospital then can't fulfill its commitment of giving you that priority treatment with related to that referral. So
it's working in partnership.
Absolutely. So it's absolutely essential that you register with your GP, that you are Armed Forces Community if you haven't already done so.
Yeah.
Okay, so GP, as I say, they have, the understanding of the armed forces, what individuals have gone through. And I think that's essential because for me, our GPs, well, for everybody, the GP is your primary first point of call when it comes to healthcare. And, I think one thing I would say about veterans, and I think we emphasized it earlier, is if we have some sort of medical condition, often we keep it bottled up. And, it's almost like, I've got a problem with my eye, don't worry, I've got another one. And I've got a problem with my arm, don't worry, I've got another one. I've got a problem with my kidney, got another one. I've got a problem with my liver, I haven't got another one of those. So yeah, it's almost like, I don't want to put a burden on anybody else. And that resonates. And a lot of veterans I speak to, exactly the same. We don't want to be a burden. We don't want to, admit that we have a defect or a medical condition. And don't worry, I've managed to, keep on my body under wraps with Brufen and Tubi grip during my armed forces career. I'm sure I can do that now. That isn't the case, and I'm not enforcing anybody to take Brufen unnecessarily.
I think that's the thing we have to understand, though, is that bottling that issue up and not getting that care when you need it means that when ultimately you have to go to the GP or you have to attend A&E, the condition is actually a lot worse. And if it was addressed earlier, it might be that condition would never have got worse, or you could have got the treatment beforehand to make your life a lot easier. But again, it's that proudness of veterans who just carry on. They get on with their daily life and think, it's just there.
Yeah. And as I say, if I went to my GP and I tried to explain my medical, a case or my medical needs associated with the military, if it was mental health, and I was trying to explain the trauma maybe that I or somebody else had gone through, if a GP, or if the practitioner doesn't understand exactly what I'm going through and tries to put I call it a plaster over a wound, then, I suppose going back to the GP, I would really consider actually, you're not supporting me as hopefully as I would do. Now, for us, in our organisation, we have and we continue to provide training for GPs that are undergoing their 4-year training cycle. So we provide the understanding, the needs, or the clinical medical needs of the armed forces community. So we provide that training when these trainee GPs come through. We provide that to North and South Staffordshire. And an example that we give when we talk about understanding the needs and sort of, supporting and delivering medical treatment is if an individual comes in maybe with mental health concern, maybe PTSD, it's actually not just a case of going, okay, I suppose anybody that isn't trained might actually go, I haven't got a clue what you're talking about, but it sounds bad. Let me give you some, this medication. Now, what that medication or what that option is doing is potentially just putting that plaster over the wound. So what we haven't actually done is got to the root cause of what's caused that PTSD. It could have been a traumatic situation on a battlefield that the individual is constantly living with as a result of that, and will constantly sort of be reminded of that by various triggers. So realistically, we need to get to the understanding of what's caused that, and that might be through some therapy, some coaching sessions, just to help sort of get through that. But also, either the individual or the family may be suffering as a result of the individual's actions, and certain an easy coping mechanism for a lot of veterans is alcohol, and then when that alcohol gets consumed and more frequently, it then becomes an addiction and a problem for the individual, but realistically a stress and strain on those family members that support that individual as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's, you know, they live with that individual, they want to, you know, help that individual, but like you say, if they go to the GP and they don't get to the root cause of it, you know, they have to again put that plaster over that wound by, you know, using alcohol. And
Yeah.
we need to get to the root of it. And I think that's good with our training, you know, with GPs in training, is that they're getting that information before they actually, you know, go into that line of work. They, you know, they're not GPs that have been working, you know, for 20 years, say, that's now new information that they need to take on board because they've already got their, you know, their practices, how they work. So by, you know, by implementing that early on in their training, it's something that they can take forward at the beginning of their training. So it's not something new.
Yeah.
And I think that works really well.
So yeah, just to summarize that, you know, if somebody went in with PTSD, it's a case of, you know, understanding what the, you know, the trauma that the individual's gone through, you know, offering that ability for, you know, some sort of therapy, you know, treatment through a range of services that are available now, but also looking to see whether an individual has an addiction as a result of that, then putting a treatment pathway in place for that, but also actually exploring whether there's any implications on the family members and whether the additional family members, you know, such as wife, partner, spouse, you know, also need some sort of, you know, assistance associated with that. And then there could be some sort of medical sort of, you know, medicine associated or a drug treatment around that to support or take an edge off it, you know, but it shouldn't naturally be that has a specific medication. Let's see you in 6 months. There really needs to be a little bit more exploration and sort of intervention around what we've just discussed. And that's, you know, that's happening now as a result of these veteran friendly practices and the training and, you know, they're having a clinical lead in that area for veterans services. So yeah, absolutely fantastic. So the initiative around veteran friendly practices, you know, it's been rolled out across England. You know, there are a lot of practices that are now veteran accredited or veteran friendly accredited. And if you want to find out if your practice is veteran friendly accredited, go on to the Royal College of General Practitioners webpage, type in or search for veteran friendly practices, and they have a list in there as part of a spreadsheet that you can explore and sort of go through that.
Yeah, definitely. It's quite an easy process to follow, and hopefully by knowing that information, you know, you can get the better support from your GP. Like I say, that's their primary source of, you know, of healthcare.
Yeah.
If we get the issues targeted first, we can hopefully stop them getting any worse.
Absolutely. But, you know, once we go, or, you know, if we go to our GP, that's the primary healthcare element. There's often then needs and services that we call on secondary healthcare, you know, more sort of detailed surgical procedures, interventions, diagnostic testing. And that's where we also have an accreditation within our secondary healthcare called the Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance. So do you want me to talk about that, or do you want to?
You can go ahead.
Okay, so the Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance, that was introduced, and basically it came apparent from something called the Gervais Report, and the Gervais Report basically identified that there wasn't a total understanding of you know, and a great support for armed forces community members, and you know, in further sort of training procedures needed to be implemented, and you know, it was introduced, you know, quite a couple of years back now, as part of the Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance, and since that initial concept rollout, all now NHS trusts within England are now accredited, which is absolutely fantastic. So the team have regional sort of leads that liaise with organisations, you know, NHS organisations such as ours, and help us to then become accredited. And the types of things that sort of that involves is having an understanding and signing of the Armed Forces Covenant, having dedicated leads associated with, you know, clinical and managerial aspects of the Armed Forces Covenant and those, you know, requirements. but also making sure that the organisation is trained, has procedures to record armed forces community patients. And, in our trust, we have processes with policies, procedures, we have training all across the trust. We've got posters put up on the wards that, signpost you and ask you whether you have served in the armed forces community. But like the primary healthcare, we also record that within our electronic patient records. And, through that, we are able to offer bespoke support and anything sort of, if anybody needs it. And just to sort of emphasize that, not every veteran, when it comes to a hospital or goes to the GP, needs additional support. So, I would class myself as quite fortunate to be in good health. And, if I went into a hospital, I wouldn't need anything over and above the fantastic services that our NHS provide already. But I do know that it's available to me if I need it.
In my role of work, that it's obviously I go and see the veterans on the ward. I have conversations with people that when we first start out, I'll sort of say, is there any support that I can give you? And it will always, most of the time, be no. But it's having that conversation with people and getting that, that conversation going and thinking, actually, now we've had this conversation, you've mentioned so and so, I actually could use some support with that. So it's having that conversation like that may, like you said, you may not need anything. And a lot of veterans that I go and see originally say, no, I don't need anything. Again, it's that pride. But having that conversation and getting that, that relationship going to, that trust, they eventually do open up and think, actually, no, you could support me with this. And again, it's having those posters up that they may have, they may have seen, they may have then disclosed it to them, and it's working really well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose what I will say on the Veterans Covenant Healthcare Alliance, the Veteran Aware accreditation as it is, it's like everything. You can put a process in place and it's only as good as constant monitoring, cascading the information, the training that happens. Now, we're very fortunate within our organisation. We have our own Defence Medical Welfare Service officer, Lucy, who goes round and visits our wards, checks compliance, making sure we've got posters up, speaks to, the armed forces leads within the wards. And on ourselves as an armed forces champion team, we actually facilitate a whole day's worth of training as part of our processes to train up champions on the wards to be advocates for their areas.
And I think that's really important because obviously sometimes one of the armed forces team may not be available. And by having those champions on the ward, they can provide that support, in the absence of the armed forces team, having the ward packs that we've created, with the information that is, available out there that the individuals may not know. Obviously, the healthcare staff may not know, but by having that training, having that information on hand, it means that they can support them as well as the armed forces team, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose what I must say on that, is in an organisation such as ours and any NHS organisation, you've got tens and tens of thousands of people, and for everybody to be in the know of every accreditation is nigh on impossible in some cases.
Yeah.
So, if you are a patient, if you are an armed forces community patient and you do come into the hospital and you do inquire into what services are available to you, if you get a negative sort of element around that, don't give up. Ask to speak to maybe the ward manager or the department manager and just say, look, you're a veteran accredited hospital, I need some more assistance. And it won't be just a fob off. Somebody will actually then go and actively either contact ourselves as the Armed Forces Champions or our Defence Medical Welfare Services officer.
And getting that information out there that the referral process to me is there, obviously takes the stress off the obviously the healthcare worker on the ward. So obviously they have very busy roles, not that they wouldn't take the time to support that individual, but they don't have the knowledge that potentially I do or the armed forces team do. And by having that referral process, which is really easy, means that the individual is getting the support that they need and also taking the pressure off the staff on the wards as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose what we'll do is we'll be doing more podcasts around the services available, to support armed forces community, and they could be, clinical, mental health,
Social isolation.
Social isolation, there's a big one. And even sort of employment. There are so many elements around there. So in the meantime, please have a look at the various sort of websites that are available to you. So the NHS has a great sort of web page around Armed Forces community support, and that's the support that is available to serving members and their spouses, partners, and so forth, immediate family, and also for those that are in the transition of leaving the armed forces, but also veterans, family members, and so on and so on. So there's so many services out there. Please do take the time to have a look.
Yeah, it can be a bit of a minefield out there, which is why obviously the UH&M Armed Forces page is great, because everything's sort of separated out into sections. So if you do have a specific need, you can go directly to that section without having 1,000 Google search reviews coming back up to when you put that you type it in. So it's good to have.
If you are an internal member of UH&M, we have our own Armed Forces community webpage in the internet under the A to Z Armed Forces and Veterans. Have a look in there. A plethora of information and guidance there for you, along with our staff leaflets and patient leaflets, and also contact numbers on how you can get in touch with us as an Armed Forces champion team.
Yeah, and if you want to become a champion, we would welcome you with open arms into our team.
Absolutely. So thank you very much for taking the time today to listen to what myself and Lucy have got to say. Hopefully it's been helpful. If you are a veteran or member of the Armed Forces community outside of our organisation, we hope it's been helpful for you.
Definitely.
Please be aware there is so much support elements out there available to you. You're not alone. Thank you very much for your service, and hopefully we'll see you soon.
Yes, definitely. We're always here.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
The end.